Welcome to the Sacred Rift, where we explore Jung's depth psychology to uncover your true self. Join us to face your shadow, heal your soul, and find your purpose. Meet Leo, 40, a pragmatic data analyst whose life is governed by logic and order. But a series of strange, meaningful coincidences related to music begins to disrupt his predictable world. This is the story of how he learned that these events weren't random chance, but the universe whispering his true purpose, a concept Carl Jung called synchronicity. Leo lived his life by a simple, unshakable creed: what cannot be measured does not matter. At 40 years old, he had constructed a world that was a testament to this philosophy. His career as a data analyst was not just a job, it was the perfect expression of his personality. He spent his days in the clean, quiet hum of servers, transforming the chaotic noise of raw data into elegant, predictable patterns. He could look at a spreadsheet with millions of entries and, with a kind of intellectual grace, find the signal in the noise, the trend line in the chaos. He brought this same methodical precision to every corner of his life. His finances were not just managed, they were optimized, tracked in a complex series of spreadsheets that projected his net worth 17 years into the future. His home was a model of functional order. His tools were hung on a pegboard, each with its own black outline tracing, a place for everything and everything in its place. His weekends were not for spontaneous leisure, but for productive projects: regrouting the bathroom tile, optimizing the sprinkler system's water usage, changing the oil in his meticulously maintained car. He was a man who believed in cause and effect, in logic, in the tangible reality of a world that could be understood, categorized, and controlled. And in this well-ordered fortress, there was no room for the messy, unpredictable passions of his youth. Tucked away in the back of a closet, behind a row of neatly labeled storage bins, was a black, hard-shell guitar case. Inside rested a Fender Stratocaster, the same one he had saved up for an entire summer to buy when he was 19. In his college years, that guitar had been an extension of his body. He and his band, Static Bloom, had played in dingy bars and at campus parties, fueled by cheap beer and the glorious, electric feeling of creating something loud and alive. Music, back then, had been his language, his religion. But life, as it does, had presented him with a choice. The path of a musician was one of uncertainty, of passion over prudence. The path of a data analyst was one of stability, of logic over longing. Leo, being Leo, chose the sensible path. He packed the guitar away, not with a sense of ceremony or sadness, but with a quiet, practical finality. He categorized music as an impractical youthful indulgence, a data point from a previous version of himself that was no longer relevant. He had built a good life, a secure life. He was, by all reasonable metrics, a success. Yet, lately, a strange kind of static had begun to creep into his well-ordered world. It wasn't a loud alarm, but a low-grade, persistent hum of dissatisfaction. He would sit at his desk, staring at the elegant curves of his data visualizations, and feel nothing. He would finish a weekend project, the new tiles perfectly aligned, and feel no sense of accomplishment. It was a feeling of stagnation, a quiet sense that he was living the same day over and over again, just with different data sets and different home repair tasks. He dismissed it as a normal symptom of middle age, a predictable dip in the long-term graph of life satisfaction. It was just noise, he told himself, and his job was to ignore the noise and focus on the signal. But he was about to discover that sometimes the noise is the signal. The pattern began on a Tuesday. Leo was at a downtown coffee shop he rarely visited, grabbing an espresso between meetings. As he waited for his order, a voice behind him called out, "Leo? Leo Maxwell? Is that you?" He turned to see a man with a familiar, friendly face, though it was now framed by thinning hair and the soft lines of middle age. It took him a moment to place him. "Dave," he said, incredulous. "Dave Chen?" It was the drummer from Static Bloom, his closest friend in college, a man he hadn't seen or spoken to in at least 15 years. Their lives had diverged so completely that they hadn't even remained friends on social media. They fell into an easy, animated conversation, the years melting away. "Man, I was just thinking about you the other day," Dave said, his eyes lighting up. "My daughter found our old demo tape in a box. She thinks we were rock stars." He laughed. "I told her we mostly played to empty rooms, but listening back we were actually pretty good. Your guitar playing, man. It was something special. That stuff meant something." The compliment landed with a strange weight. For the rest of the day, Leo couldn't shake the conversation. It was a pleasant nostalgia, nothing more, he told himself. A random coincidence. The city was big, but not that big. It was bound to happen eventually. He filed the event away as an anomaly, a statistical blip, and refocused on his work. A week later, on a Saturday, Leo was doing what he often did on weekends, methodically browsing a series of thrift stores, looking for old, high-quality tools that he could refurbish. He was in a dusty, poorly organized shop on the far side of town, a place he had never been before. As he sifted through a bin of rusty wrenches, his eyes caught on a crate of old vinyl records tucked under a table. He wasn't a collector, but on a whim, he knelt and began flipping through the worn cardboard sleeves. Most of it was the usual thrift store fare, old Christmas albums, forgotten pop singers from the 70s. And then his fingers froze. He pulled out a record. The cover was a stark, black and white photograph of a lone guitarist, his face obscured by shadows. The artist was a man named Silas Reed, a brilliant but tragically obscure blues rock guitarist from the late 60s who had released only one official album before disappearing from the music world entirely. This was Leo's hero, his biggest influence. The album was incredibly rare, a collector's item that sold for hundreds of dollars online when it even appeared. And here it was in a random thrift store for $1. His heart began to beat faster. This was uncanny. The logical part of his brain immediately started calculating probabilities. The chance of his old bandmate mentioning his guitar playing and the chance of him finding the specific rare album by his favorite guitarist in the span of a single week were infinitesimally small. It was a bizarre, statistically improbable coincidence. He bought the record, took it home, and placed it on a shelf where it sat like a strange, silent question mark. The third event was the one that broke through his defenses. Leo was at a mandatory, multi-day work conference in another city. It was the kind of event he usually hated: forced networking, lukewarm coffee, and endless PowerPoint presentations. On the final day, during the closing luncheon, he found himself seated at a large round table with strangers. He exchanged polite, professional small talk with the people on either side of him. The woman to his right, a friendly, energetic woman in her 50s named Maria, asked him what he did for fun outside of work. It was a standard icebreaker question, but Leo drew a blank. "I do a lot of home improvement projects," he said, the answer sounding hollow even to his own ears. "That's great," she said. "I've always wished I were handy. All my free time goes into my passion project." "Oh yeah? What's that?" Leo asked, mostly out of politeness. "I run a small nonprofit," she explained. "It's called the Chord Project. We collect donated instruments and volunteer musicians teach free lessons to kids in low-income neighborhoods. Giving a kid a guitar, it can change their whole world. It gives them a voice." The word guitar landed in the air between them with an almost audible thud. Leo felt a cold chill run down his spine. The coffee shop, the record store, and now this. It was no longer a pair of coincidences. It was a pattern, a sequence. 3 data points, all pointing in the same impossible direction. It felt as if the universe was leaning in and whispering a single word directly into his ear. This is the phenomenon that the great Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung called synchronicity. He defined it as a meaningful coincidence, an acausal connecting principle. In our rational cause-and-effect world, we believe that 2 events are only related if one causes the other. But Jung proposed that there is another kind of connection in the universe, a connection based on meaning. Synchronicity occurs when an event in the outer, physical world aligns perfectly with an inner, psychological state. The events are not causally linked, but they are meaningfully linked for the person experiencing them. Leo's inner state was one of quiet stagnation, a life disconnected from his youthful passion for music. And the outer world had suddenly arranged itself to reflect that inner state back to him, not once, but 3 times. The encounter with his bandmate, the discovery of the rare record, the conversation with the woman from the nonprofit, these were not just random chance events happening to him. They were synchronicities. They were the unconscious mind, the deep, wise part of his psyche, conspiring with the universe to get his attention. It was a sign that the part of him he had packed away in a closet all those years ago was not dead. It was alive, and it wanted to be heard. The noise he had been trying to ignore was, in fact, the most important signal of his life. Leo flew home from the conference in a state of profound inner turmoil. The conversation with Maria, the woman from the Chord Project, had acted as a catalyst, transforming the series of strange coincidences from a curious anomaly into a deeply personal and unsettling pattern. His mind, the well-ordered domain of logic and reason, was now a battlefield. One part of him, the data analyst, the pragmatist, was working overtime to debunk the entire experience. It was his old defense mechanism, his ego fighting desperately to restore order. This is classic confirmation bias, the logical voice argued as he stared out the airplane window at the patchwork of fields below. You were feeling a bit stagnant, so your brain started looking for patterns related to a past interest. It's a psychological quirk, nothing more. You met one person from your past, found one lucky record, and had one conversation. If you connect those dots, you're creating a narrative that isn't really there. It's statistically improbable, but not impossible. It's just chance. He tried to cling to this explanation. It was comforting, safe. It meant his world was still governed by the predictable laws of probability. It meant he didn't have to do anything, that he could go back to his life of spreadsheets and home repairs, and this strange, disruptive feeling would eventually fade like a phantom radio signal. But another part of him, a quieter, more intuitive voice he hadn't heard from in years, refused to be silenced. This voice didn't argue with logic. It simply presented a feeling, a deep, unshakable conviction that these events were not empty coincidences. They were meaningful. The feeling itself had a unique quality, a certain weight or resonance that set it apart from everyday thoughts. Jung called this quality numinous, a term he borrowed from the theologian Rudolf Otto to describe an experience that feels sacred, mysterious, and profoundly significant. It's the chill that runs down your spine, the sense of awe, the feeling that you have just brushed up against a hidden layer of reality. This was what Leo was experiencing. His logical mind could explain away the events, but it couldn't explain away the feeling. The sheer emotional impact of the synchronicities was a data point his spreadsheets couldn't account for. The business card Maria had given him felt heavy in his pocket. He had taken it automatically, a polite reflex. Now it felt like a charged object, a key to a door he wasn't sure he wanted to open. The resistance was immense. The thought of stepping back into the world of music felt terrifying. It meant confronting the part of himself he had deliberately exiled. It meant admitting that his perfectly logical life was, perhaps, incomplete. It meant being a beginner again, a 40-year-old man fumbling with chords, a novice in a world of passion he had long since abandoned. The ego hates to be a novice. It hates to be vulnerable. And so it fought back with its most powerful weapon, fear. For days he did nothing. He went back to work, back to his routines. He tried to bury the experience under a mountain of familiar tasks. He organized his garage, updated his financial projections, and tried to force the world back into its neat, predictable boxes. But the pattern haunted him. The memory of Dave's words, the stark cover of the Silas Reed album on his shelf, the echo of Maria's passion for her project, they were a constant, silent presence. The question began to form in his mind, tentatively at first, then with more urgency. What if it's not random? What if this is life? The universe? Something trying to tell me something? This question, what does this mean for me, is the crucial turning point in any encounter with synchronicity. It marks the shift from being a passive observer of strange events to becoming an active participant in a meaningful dialogue. It is the moment one stops asking, what are the odds of this happening, and starts asking, why is this happening now to me? It is the beginning of the inner journey, the moment we acknowledge that the universe might not be a cold, random machine, but a living, intelligent system that communicates with us through the language of symbol and meaning. Finally, after a week of inner wrestling, Leo knew he couldn't simply ignore it. The feeling of being stuck, which he had previously dismissed as middle-aged malaise, now felt like a symptom of a deeper spiritual starvation. To continue to ignore the pattern would be an act of profound self-betrayal. He didn't need to have a grand plan. He didn't need to quit his job or declare himself a musician. He just needed to take one small step. He needed to respond. That Saturday morning, instead of heading to the hardware store, he walked to the closet in the spare room. He pulled aside the storage bins, the plastic scraping against the floor. There, in the back, was the black hardshell case, covered in a thin layer of dust. He lifted it out. It felt both heavier and lighter than he remembered. He laid it flat on the bed and clicked open the tarnished metal latches. The guitar was nestled inside in the worn, red velvet lining, exactly as he had left it nearly 2 decades ago. He lifted it out. His fingers, now accustomed to the precise tapping of a keyboard, felt clumsy and foreign on the fretboard. The strings were old and dull. He plucked one, and it produced a flat, lifeless thud. He found the old tuner he had left in the case's storage compartment, replaced its long-dead battery, and slowly, painstakingly, began to bring each string back to life. The process was methodical, familiar, and deeply satisfying. As he tightened the last peg and the final string rang out with a clear, resonant note, a wave of something that felt like relief washed over him. He hadn't played a song. He hadn't written a melody. He had simply tuned the instrument. But in doing so, he had tuned a part of himself that had been silent for far too long. This was the first small step. A few days later, emboldened by this private ritual, he took the next one. He pulled Maria's business card from his wallet. His thumb hovered over the call button on his phone. The fear was still there, the voice of the ego whispering warnings of awkwardness and failure. He ignored it. Instead of calling, he chose a less intimidating route. He opened his laptop and composed a short, simple email. "Dear Maria," he wrote, "we met at the conference luncheon last week. My name is Leo Maxwell. I was very inspired to hear about the chord project. I used to play guitar many years ago and have been thinking about it recently. I was wondering if you could tell me a little more about how the volunteer program works." He read it over a dozen times, editing it for tone, making sure it sounded casual, non-committal. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he hit send. The act was small, low risk. He wasn't committing to anything. He was just asking a question. But this small action was a reply. It was a signal sent back to the universe, a message that said, "I'm listening." Maria replied within hours, her email as warm and enthusiastic as she had been in person. She told him they had a volunteer orientation the following Saturday and invited him to come, just to observe. "No pressure, no commitment. Just come and see what we do," she wrote. That Saturday, Leo found himself in the basement of a community center, a space that was the polar opposite of his sleek corporate office. The room was noisy, chaotic, and filled with a vibrant, joyful energy. Kids of all ages were scattered around, some plucking tentatively at ukuleles, others banging enthusiastically on small percussion instruments. And in the corner, a volunteer was showing a young girl, no older than 10, how to form a G chord on a small acoustic guitar. The girl's face was a mask of intense concentration, her small fingers struggling to contort into the correct shape. Maria introduced him to the girl, whose name was Sophia. "Leo here used to be a guitar player," Maria said with a smile. Sophia looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Is it hard?" she asked. "It is at first," Leo said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Your fingers have to learn a new way to move. Here, let me show you." He knelt beside her and gently adjusted her fingers on the fretboard. "Try to press down right here, just behind the metal fret," he said softly, "and keep your thumb flat on the back of the neck, like this." He guided her hand, and she tried again. She strummed the strings, and this time, a clear, recognizable chord rang out. A huge grin spread across her face. "I did it," she shouted, her voice filled with pure, unadulterated triumph. And in that moment, watching the sheer joy on that child's face, Leo felt something click into place within him. A feeling of rightness so profound it almost brought him to his knees. The pattern, the synchronicity, yes, it all led to this. His purpose wasn't to be a rock star on a stage, the dream of his 19-year-old self. It was to be here, in this noisy basement, sharing the gift that had once been his. The path had revealed itself, not through a grand, logical plan, but by following the trail of meaningful breadcrumbs the universe had left for him. He had taken one small step and then another, and in doing so had walked right into the heart of his own life. The journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. But for the first time in 20 years, he felt like he was finally on the right road. Leo still works with data, but his life is no longer just numbers. He found the missing variable in the joy of teaching music. He learned that life's most meaningful patterns aren't in spreadsheets, but in the synchronicities that guide us home. The universe isn't random, it's a conversation. The only question is if we are brave enough to listen and reply. Thanks for diving into the sacred rift. Subscribe, share your thoughts below, and join us next time to explore your inner truth and live a life that's authentically yours.